At 6:30 a.m. on December 26, 1944, Colonel John W. Barriger stood on a frozen airstrip in northeastern France, listening to transport engines warming in darkness. Snow muffled footsteps, frost clung to canvas wings and aluminum fuselages, and the temperature hovered well below zero as ground crews stamped their boots, tugged gloves tight, and avoided glancing east toward the distant flashes of German artillery pounding Bastogne. The cold was not the only thing pressing in. Everyone on that airfield understood what those guns meant. Inside the town, fewer than 20,000 American soldiers remained surrounded, their supplies collapsing faster than the weather. Food stocks were nearly gone, ammunition was running low, and medical stores had already been exhausted while German commanders convinced themselves winter had finished the job for them. For 5 straight days, thick Ardennes cloud cover had sealed Bastogne off from the sky. No transports, no fighters, no reconnaissance, no drops, only snow, fog, and artillery hammering frozen streets. German field staffs had watched American radio traffic fall quiet, intercepted prisoner interrogations, and pored over captured maps until the pattern seemed obvious. They knew what starvation looked like on a battlefield, and they concluded the encircled 101st Airborne Division had perhaps 48 hours left. What they did not yet realize was that hundreds of American transport aircraft were warming their engines less than 60 miles away, and that the United States Army Air Forces was preparing to gamble everything on an airlift through weather pilots described as nearly unsurvivable. At that same moment inside Bastogne, Major General Anthony McAuliffe stood in a candlelit cellar scanning casualty lists by flashlight, while hospital wards overflowed and morphine dwindled. Bandages were boiled and reused, artillery crews fired, captured German shells, and rations were cut yet again as shell bursts rattled shattered buildings above. He had already sent his famous reply to surrender demands 2 days earlier. Nuts. But bravado did not refill magazines, and German guns continued tightening the ring around the town. Snow drifted through broken rooftops while trees snapped under shell fire, and paratroopers hacked foxholes into frozen ground with bayonets after entrenching tools shattered. From the German side of the lines, reconnaissance patrols reported vanished supply trucks, burned fuel dumps, and airfields too damaged or snowbound to operate. German generals began drafting confident lines in their evening situation reports. The pocket would collapse soon, the Americans were isolated, and the weather at last belonged to Germany. At Luftwaffe air bases farther east, officers reached the same conclusion German field commanders had already written into their reports. No transport aircraft could fly through that cloud ceiling, no fighters could escort them, and any crew foolish enough to try would be effectively blind. Which was exactly why Colonel Barriger and his men were being ordered into the sky. Barriger commanded elements of the 9th Air Force's troop carrier unit C-47 Skytrains that were ugly, reliable, slow, and designed for one purpose alone, hauling cargo into places nobody else wanted to go. Their instructions were brutally simple: break the siege, drop everything, and keep dropping until Bastogne survived. The briefing was short and blunt. Meteorologists reported a narrow weather window forming over the Ardennes after days of total cloud cover, not good weather, merely something slightly less impossible. Pilots would fly low, navigate by rivers and road junctions, hope snow glare blinded flak batteries, and prey escorts arrived in time. Hope was not doctrine, but it was all they had. At 6:45 a.m. engines roared across the airfield, and propellers bit into frozen air as crews stacked parachute-wrapped artillery shells, crates of plasma, boxes of rifle ammunition, medical kits, fuel cans, and food, everything that had failed to reach Bastogne for nearly a week. Barriger paused beside one aircraft where a young pilot traced a grease pencil route across the cockpit glass straight through German-held territory, leaned in close, and told him calmly, "If the clouds close again, don't turn back unless ordered." The pilot answered with a nod, no bravado, only calculation. At 7:00 a.m., the first transports thundered down the runway in sequence, lumbering shapes lifting into gray sky and turning east toward enemy lines. Hours later inside Bastogne, artillery crews heard engines and doubted their ears. The sound, too faint, too high, too impossible, while German listening posts also dismissed it at first as fighters rather than transports in that weather. Divisional headquarters near Hufeleis logged the noise casually until observers began phoning in sharper reports, large formations, slow aircraft, low altitude, flying straight toward the encirclement. That forced German officers to write a phrase few expected to see in a December 1944 report: enemy airlift suspected. The word mattered because the idea itself felt absurd, a full-scale resupply mission through winter storms, across enemy-held forests, with Luftwaffe units still active and flak guns guarding ridgelines. To German ears, it sounded reckless. It sounded American. Inside German armored formations surrounding Bastogne, some commanders began dragging anti-aircraft batteries closer to the perimeter, while others ordered fighter patrols to stand ready. Still, many believed the weather itself would crush the attempt before it truly began, having watched Allied air power vanish for days and convinced themselves the sky still belonged to winter. What they did not yet realize was that hundreds of aircraft were already threading valleys, skimming treetops, and following frozen rivers eastward. By the time German guns finished repositioning, parachutes were already blooming over snow-covered fields around Bastogne, white canopies opening above red bundles and green crates carrying thousands of tons of survival. This was not symbolism or rescue theater. It was logistics warfare. And for the first time since the Ardennes offensive began, German commanders were confronting a problem they had not calculated: an American army that could be surrounded and still fed from the sky. Within 48 hours, that realization would ripple from frontline headquarters in Belgium all the way back to Berlin and force a rewrite of how this offensive might actually end. At 8:15 a.m. on December 26, 1944, the first C-47 transports crossed the western edge of the Bastogne pocket and immediately dropped below the cloud ceiling, flying lower than doctrine preferred, and low enough for crews to see shell bursts peppering frozen fields and rifle fire carving white streaks through the snow beneath them. Pilots had been ordered to descend the moment they cleared the Meuse River, slipping under a ceiling barely 800 feet high into a maze of hills, treetops, church steeples, power lines, and German 88mm guns swinging toward the sound of engines. From inside the cockpit, Bastogne no longer looked like a town but a crater field, smoke pillars rising from shattered farmhouses while road junctions glowed black with burned vehicles, and frozen highways glittered where tanks had churned through snow. Navigator Lieutenant Harold Quinn leaned forward in the jump seat of one transport, calling headings over the intercom while tracking the curves of icy rivers below. The formation had been planned 20 aircraft wide, but cloud banks swallowed planes one by one until it fractured into scattered elements, some aircraft emerging alone while others never surfaced where expected. Each crew flew its own war. Behind the transports, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs prowled above the cloud deck waiting for breaks where German interceptors might punch through. But winter storms made timing unpredictable. Fighters burned fuel faster than the slow Skytrains could fly, and for the first crucial minutes over the pocket, the transports were exposed and unescorted. German flak crews noticed immediately. At a gun battery near Neuville, Lieutenant Otto Weiss swung his 88mm piece toward a slow silhouette, drifting through snow haze at barely 2,000 yards. He fired, the shell bursting above the left wing as black smoke erupted, and the aircraft sagged before clawing back into level flight. Weiss fired again, shredding a parachute bundle as it spilled from the door, and scattering medical crates across a frozen field instead of letting them drift safely down. Inside Bastogne, paratroopers sprinted through shell bursts toward falling bundles while dragging wounded men on doors and fence panels, and medics tore into crates before parachutes even collapsed. Morphine arrived first, followed by bandages and blood plasma. Behind the encirclement, German headquarters watched situation maps change color as red pencil lines crept along ridge lines, where flak batteries were being repositioned, and telephone operators relayed frantic calls between artillery regiments and Luftwaffe. Controllers reporting enemy transports, multiple waves, and estimates running into the hundreds. The scale unsettled commanders. This was no demonstration. It looked like commitment. At 10:30 a.m., Oberstleutnant Karl Fischer, operations officer for 1 Armored Corps around Bastogne, received aerial reconnaissance photographs taken through thin cloud breaks showing dozens of parachutes blooming inside the pocket. He circled them in grease pencil and wrote a single note in the margin: "Enemy supply operation appears systematic." The word mattered. Systematic meant planned, repeatable, and something far more dangerous than desperation. It meant infrastructure. Even as German officers studied the photos, the transports kept coming, and by midday, improvised corridors formed in the sky as pilots passed routes by radio whenever they found valleys clear of flak. German fighters finally reached the airspace just before noon, as Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft dropped through breaks in the cloud and dove for the slowest Skytrains they could find. One C-47 absorbed cannon fire through its cargo door and lost hydraulic pressure. Yet the pilot held it level long enough for the crew chief to shove 3 more bundles into open sky before limping west trailing fluid, while another transport feathered a dead engine and kept flying anyway. Inside Bastogne, an artillery officer watched crates tumble near his battery and laughed for the first time in a week when he saw what they contained: shells of the correct caliber, still warm from engine compartments. On the perimeter, German infantry units soon reported American patrols growing bolder as machine gun fire intensified. Batteries that had fallen silent resumed firing, and fresh ammunition was hauled forward on sleds into prepared positions. That shift raced up command chains faster than any Luftwaffe victory claim. At 2:20 p.m., Fischer returned to his maps, sketching arrows pointing inward and crossing others out as he recognized what the pattern meant. An encirclement designed to starve its target was now feeding it. Inside Luftwaffe command posts, officers compared optimistic kill claims to radio intercepts and reconnaissance reports: several transports destroyed, perhaps a dozen, but parachutes continued to fall. New drops followed old ones, and aircraft kept arriving. The arithmetic refused to cooperate. German planners had built the Ardennes gamble around one assumption: that winter would cripple Allied air power, strand supply columns, and collapse surrounded formations. Instead, the Americans were flying an air bridge through snowstorms. At 5:30 p.m., as daylight faded, headquarters sent a message up the chain stating that enemy aerial resupply had succeeded in part, and that the encircled force remained combat effective. In plain language, the pocket was not dying. It was stabilizing. Back inside Bastogne, McAuliffe walked through a courtyard, stacked chest-high with fresh supplies as soldiers cheered over mortar rounds, radio batteries, medical kits, and chocolate bars, heating soup on helmet stoves, and reloading magazines that had been rationed only hours earlier. That night, German artillery resumed bombardment with fresh urgency, but the tone had shifted. They were firing at an enemy that now possessed bandages, shells, fuel, and fighter cover waiting above the clouds. After dark, German commanders scanning reports noticed a new term creeping into summaries: concern. To them, the word meant uncertainty, recalculation, and a plan beginning to bleed. Within the next 24 hours, staff officers would begin asking the question no one had wanted to voice: what if the Americans could keep the airlift going? At 7:10 a.m. on December 27, 1944, German Army headquarters west of the Rhine received a report from field staff surrounding Bastogne, listing 3 figures: sorties flown, supplies delivered, and American artillery firings. All 3 had climbed overnight. The airlift had not slowed. It had accelerated. Meteorological sections confirmed the worst possible news: not clear skies, but fractured cloud layers that were good enough for escorts, bombing, and repetition. German planners had built their Ardennes gamble on winter storms, grounding Allied aircraft for weeks. They had not prepared for a sustained air corridor. By mid-morning, Luftwaffe controllers warned that fighter units were burning fuel faster than it could be replaced. Maintenance crews saw serviceability rates drop, pilots were exhausted, and several Gruppen were flying 3 sorties a day, simply to harass transports. Flak units reported ammunition shortages after shifting batteries forward too quickly for icy road supply columns to keep pace. Inside German situation rooms, arrows on maps slowed or halted entirely, while staff officers quietly marked American counterattacks, beginning on the southern edge of the Bastogne pocket. They were limited and local, but they did not resemble the behavior of a formation on the brink of collapse. Captured prisoners confirmed it. Full artillery barrages had resumed, hot food was being served, wounded were being treated, and one interrogator noted morale inside the pocket as unexpectedly firm. That sentence raced upward through command channels. By noon, German commanders confronted a reality that no longer matched their planning. Bastogne was not starving. It was being sustained. Sustaining Bastogne meant sustaining the road network radiating from it, roads German armored units required for their drive west. Inside Allied command posts, the figures told the opposite story. By the end of December 27th, more than 700 sorties had dropped thousands of tons of artillery ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, radio batteries, winter clothing, and everything the encircled force had lacked 48 hours earlier. The airlift had become routine. For German planners, that was the most dangerous word of all. Routine meant predictable. Predictable meant scalable. German intelligence officers tried to map the structure behind the Operation Troop Carrier Wings, 9th Air Force coordination, meteorology units pushing forecasts hourly, and forward air controllers riding in gliders and liaison aircraft to mark drop zones. This was no longer improvisation. It was a system, and systems were difficult to break. At Luftwaffe headquarters, interception estimates were revised downward as escort fighters now arrived on time. Thunderbolts strafed flak sites, and Mustangs chased interceptors before they could reach the transports. Some German pilots reported being attacked the moment they burst through cloud layers, proof that Allied fighters had learned the routes, anticipated timing, and turned the air corridor into a defended highway. German staff officers drafted alternatives: greater ground pressure, night attacks, concentrated artillery, but every option demanded fuel, ammunition, and time, resources already stretched thin. Bastogne was buying the Americans exactly that: time. Within Bastogne, soldiers patched roofs with parachute silk. Engineers cleared roads for relief columns advancing from the south. Artillery units plotted new fire missions using freshly dropped maps, and a chaplain recorded that the sound of engines overhead had become comforting. 3 days earlier, that thought would have seemed impossible. Now it meant survival. On December 28, 1944, German headquarters issued a blunt assessment that the encirclement had failed to achieve decisive results and that the American force remained operational. Translated into plain language, the siege was not working. Senior commanders shifted attention from crushing Bastogne to slowing Allied relief forces. The Ardennes offensive had stopped expanding. It was now struggling to endure. By the first days of January 1945, armored spearheads across the Ardennes stalled, fuel shortages mounted, air attacks hammered German columns, and the breakout from the south tightened. Bastogne was no longer a dying pocket. It had become an anchor pinning divisions in place while Allied forces regrouped and counterattacked. German planners had not lost the war at Bastogne. They had lost momentum. And in modern war, momentum is oxygen. Lose it long enough, and everything suffocates. Post-war German studies would later conclude that the American airlift forced an early shift from offensive maneuver to defensive posture. Those were clinical words. What they meant was simpler. German commanders had expected winter to starve Bastogne into surrender. Instead, the sky kept feeding it. That single miscalculation helped unravel the largest gamble Germany would make on the Western Front. If you found this breakdown compelling, tap like to let the system know that deep, documentary-style World War II stories are worth sharing. And if you want more hidden turning points and frontline logistics battles, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Drop your questions in the comments below. They often shape which stories come next.